I, David, Alpha King of the Crescent Moon Pack, reject you, Elisa, as my fated mate and Luna." The words dropped into the cavernous stone hall like stones into a still, black lake. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on the gathered pack. Hundreds of eyes flicked from the imposing figure of the king, jaw tight, eyes cold, to the slight woman standing before him. They waited for the screams, the tears, the desperate begging that always followed a rejection. A Luna discarded before her ascension. It was unprecedented. It was devastating. Elisa stood perfectly still. She didn't fall to her knees. She didn't cry out. She simply met his gaze, her dark eyes clear and unfathomably calm, and said, "I accept your rejection." Then, the Alpha King snapped. The great hall of the Crescent Moon Pack was a monument to their history, built of dark granite and illuminated by torches that cast long, flickering shadows. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. Elisa felt the collective breath of the pack hitched, suspended in the air. The rejection hung between her and David, a jagged, invisible tear in the fabric of their reality. David towered over her, his broad shoulders tense beneath the dark fabric of his ceremonial coat. His face, usually a mask of controlled authority, betrayed a flicker of something raw. Confusion? Anger? It was gone before Elisa could define it, replaced by a rigid, unyielding stoicism. He had expected her to shatter. He had braced himself for a storm of emotion. Her calm acceptance was an anomaly he couldn't compute. "You accept," David repeated, his voice low, a dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. "I do," Elisa said, her voice steady, though a tremor ran through her hands. She clasped them behind her back, hiding the physical manifestation of the sudden, hollow ache in her chest. The bond, that intangible thread that had tethered her to him since the moment their eyes met under the full moon 2 weeks ago, was severing. It felt less like a clean cut and more like a slow unraveling. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Beta Marcus, standing slightly behind David, shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed in concern. The elders, seated in their carved wooden chairs on the dais, exchanged uneasy glances. The script had been flipped, and no one knew their lines. "Are you deaf, girl?" Elder Thomas, a man with a face like weathered leather, finally broke the silence, leaning forward on his silver-tipped cane. "The king has rejected you. You are to leave this territory by dawn." Elisa didn't flinch. She had known the consequences. Rejection meant exile. A mate without a pack was vulnerable, a target. But she also knew her own worth. She was not a prize to be discarded, nor a problem to be swept away. "I understand the laws, Elder Thomas," Elisa replied, her gaze shifting to the old man before returning to David. "I will require time to gather my belongings, and my younger brother, Leo. We will be gone before the sun clears the eastern ridge." David's jaw clenched so tight the muscle fluttered visibly. "Your brother stays," he growled. "He is pack-born. He is my responsibility. He is my blood." Elisa countered, the first hint of steel threading through her voice. "Where I go, oh, he goes. Or are you intent on breaking more than just our bond tonight, Alpha?" The silence returned, heavier this time, thick with unspoken accusations. Elisa wasn't just accepting the rejection. She was dictating terms. It was a dangerous game, but she had nothing left to lose. The pain of the breaking bond was building, a dull roar in her ears. But she forced herself to stand tall. She would not let them see her break. She would leave this place with her dignity intact, even if it cost her everything else. The walk back to her small cottage on the outskirts of the territory felt like a journey across a vast, unforgiving desert. The cold night air bit through her thin shawl, but the chill was secondary to the agonizing, tearing sensation within her. The mate bond, a primal connection meant to be unbreakable, was snapping, thread by thread. Each severed connection sent a shockwave of nausea and grief through her system. Elisa focused on putting one foot in front of the other, her vision blurring at the edges. She couldn't collapse now. She had to pack. She had to wake Leo. She had to explain to a 10-year-old boy why they were leaving the only home he had ever known in the middle of the night. When she reached the cottage, she bypassed the main living area and went straight to Leo's small bedroom. He was curled up under a patchwork quilt, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The sight of him, innocent and vulnerable, almost broke her resolve. The tears she had held back in the great hall threatened to spill, but she swallowed hard, pushing them down. "Leo," she whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. "Leo, wake up, sweetie." He groaned, swatting blindly at her hand. "5 more minutes, Elle." "No, Leo, we have to go. Now." The urgency in her voice cut through his sleep-addled mind. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, his messy brown hair sticking up in every direction. "Go. Go where? It's dark outside." "We're leaving the pack, Leo," Elisa said, keeping her voice even. She moved to his small dresser and began pulling out clothes, stuffing them haphazardly into a duffel bag. "Leaving? Why?" Leo's voice hitched with rising panic. "Did I do something wrong? Did you?" Elisa stopped, turning to face him. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. "No, Leo, neither of us did anything wrong. The Alpha, David and I, we had a disagreement. He decided it's best if we leave." But my friends are here. School is here," Leo protested, tears welling in his eyes. I know, Elisa said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed and pulling him into a tight hug. She felt his small body tremble against hers, and the ache in her chest intensified. "I'm so sorry, Leo. But we have to stick together, okay? Just you and me. We'll find a new place. A better place." She helped him dress, her movements efficient and hurried. Every second they lingered was another agonizing pull on the fraying bond. She needed to put distance between herself and David, hoping that physical separation would somehow ease the internal severing. As they left the cottage, the duffel bags heavy in their hands, Elisa paused at the edge of the forest. She looked back toward the heart of the territory, where the Alpha's mansion stood on a slight rise, its windows dark. She wondered if David was feeling the same tearing pain, if his stoic facade had cracked in the privacy of his own rooms. A sharp, stabbing pain erupted in her chest, dropping her to her knees. She gasped, clutching her shirt, unable to draw a breath. The bond had snapped. The final thread had been cut. "Elisa!" Leo cried, dropping his bag and kneeling beside her. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Elisa squeezed her eyes shut, fighting against the overwhelming wave of emptiness that washed over her. It was as if a part of her soul had been carved out, leaving a hollow, echoing void. She forced herself to open her eyes, offering Leo a weak, unconvincing smile. "I'm fine, Leo. Just lost my footing." She pushed herself up, ignoring the tremor in her legs. "Come on, let's go." She turned away from the crescent moon territory and walked into the dark, unwelcoming forest. She didn't look back. David paced the length of his study, his boots thudding heavily against the hardwood floor. The room, usually a sanctuary of quiet reflection, felt stifling. He had expected the rejection to be painful. He had known the ancient texts spoke of a severing that tested the very limits of a werewolf's endurance. But he hadn't anticipated the suffocating silence that had followed. He hadn't anticipated her calm. He stopped at the window, staring out into the darkness that swallowed the forest edge. He could feel it, the exact moment the bond completely severed. It wasn't just a physical pain. It was a profound, echoing emptiness that left him feeling unmoored, adrift in his own territory. "Alpha," a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. David didn't turn. He recognized the heavy tread of Beta Marcus. "What is it, Marcus?" "They're gone. The scouts reported they crossed the eastern border 10 minutes ago." David clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. Gone. She had actually left. He had rejected her to protect the pack, to prevent a perceived weakness from spreading through their ranks. He needed a Luna who was strong, dominant, someone who commanded respect without effort. Elisa, with her quiet demeanor and gentle nature, didn't fit the mold. Or so he had convinced himself. But her calm acceptance in the great hall hadn't looked like weakness. It had looked like a quiet, unyielding strength that he hadn't recognized until it was too late. "And the boy?" David asked, his voice strained. "He went with her, as she said he would." Marcus hesitated, stepping further into the room. "David, the elders are unsettled." Her reaction, the way she spoke to Elder Thomas, it wasn't what they expected. It wasn't what any of us expected. They expected her to beg. David said bitterly, turning away from the window. They expected a spectacle. She denied them that. "She denied you that too," Marcus pointed out quietly. David shot him a sharp look, but Marcus met his gaze without flinching. The Beta was one of the few people who dared to speak the truth, even when it was unwelcome. "I didn't want her to beg, Marcus," David said, his voice dropping to a low, defensive rumble. "I wanted her to understand. I made a choice for the good of the pack." "Did you?" Marcus challenged gently. "Or did you make a choice based on fear? Fear of what you don't understand?" David turned back to the window, the emptiness gnawing at him again. The silence in the great hall. Her calm acceptance. The sudden void where their bond had been. It was all culminating into a slow burning realization that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. He had expected her to fight for him. He had expected her tears to validate his decision, to prove that the bond was real, even if he was choosing to break it. But she hadn't fought. She hadn't cried. She had simply accepted it, and in doing so, she had taken the power of the rejection away from him. He was the Alpha King, but in that moment, he felt entirely powerless. The pack had fallen silent, not out of respect, but out of shock. And now, the silence was deafening. Suddenly, a sharp, agonizing cramp seized David's chest. He stumbled back, clutching his heart, a low groan escaping his lips. It wasn't the pain of the severing. This was different. It was a raw, primal panic, a sense of impending doom that had nothing to do with the broken bond. "David!" Marcus lunged forward, catching him as his knees buckled. "What is it? What's wrong?" David gasped for air, his vision swimming. "The bond," he managed to choke out, his voice a ragged whisper. It's not gone." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But the severing is complete. The scouts said—" "I don't care what they said," David growled, fighting to stay conscious as another wave of pain crashed over him. This pain was different, sharper, more frantic. It felt like a desperate SOS, a silent scream echoing across the distance. "She's in danger," David whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He pushed Marcus away, struggling to his feet, ignoring the agonizing protests of his own body. Elisa is in danger. He had rejected her. He had cast her out. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The snap he felt wasn't just the breaking of his composure. It was the realization that he couldn't let her go. The forest beyond the crescent moon borders was a sprawling, untamed wilderness that cared nothing for pack politics or broken hearts. As Elisa led Leo deeper into the dense thicket, the temperature seemed to plummet with every step. The canopy above was a tangled web of ancient branches that blotted out the moonlight, plunging the world into a claustrophobic, oppressive darkness. The crunch of their footsteps on frost-hardened leaves sounded deafeningly loud to Elisa's heightened, panicked senses. She gripped Leo's small mittened hand so tightly her knuckles ached. The boy was dragging his feet, his initial adrenaline having given way to a profound, weary confusion. The heavy duffel bag strapped across Elisa's shoulder dug a brutal trench into her collarbone. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the hollow, echoing cavern inside her chest where her mate bond had once pulsed. It didn't just feel empty. It felt as though a vital organ had been surgically removed without anesthesia. "Elisa," Leo whispered, his voice trembling in the freezing air. "It's too dark. I can't see the path anymore." "I know, buddy. Keep your eyes on my back," Elisa replied, keeping her tone miraculously level. She couldn't afford to let him hear the terror thrumming in her veins. "We just need to put a few more miles behind us before we rest." In truth, she had no idea where they were going. Her only objective had been to escape the immediate humiliation and the suffocating presence of the Alpha King. But out here, in the lawless expanse between territories, she was painfully aware of their vulnerability. A mateless female and a pup were the lowest on the hierarchical food chain of the wild. A sudden, sharp snap echoed through the trees to their left. Elisa froze, instantly pulling Leo tightly against her side. The forest, which had been alive with the subtle rustling of wind and nocturnal insects, abruptly plunged into a dead, unnatural silence. It was the silence of prey, realizing a predator was near. She strained her ears, forcing her breathing to shallow, silent intervals. At first, there was nothing. Then, a low, wet sound reached her. The heavy padding of paws on damp earth, accompanied by a scent that made her stomach churn. It was the smell of stagnant water, decaying pine, and old blood. Rogues, wolves without a pack, driven mad by isolation and entirely unburdened by pack law. Leo breathed, burying his face in her coat. "Shh," she commanded instantly, pressing her hand over his mouth. She scanned the impenetrable darkness, her eyes desperately searching for a defensible position. To their right, the massive roots of a fallen oak tree had torn up a section of the earth, creating a shallow, shadowed depression. Moving with agonizing slowness, she pushed Leo backward toward the roots. "Get in there," she mouthed, shoving him gently into the hollow. "Do not make a sound, no matter what happens. Understand?" Leo nodded, his eyes wide pools of sheer terror reflecting the faint ambient light. He curled himself into a tight ball, practically vanishing into the shadows of the dirt and roots. Elisa stood up, placing her back to the fallen tree, effectively blocking the entrance to Leo's hiding spot. She reached down, her fingers closing blindly over the cold, rough bark of a heavy, shattered tree limb resting on the ground. She hefted it, testing its weight. It was a pathetic weapon against fully grown rogue wolves, But she would not go down without making them bleed. The underbrush parted violently a dozen yards away. 3 sets of glowing, jaundiced eyes materialized from the ink-black shadows. They didn't bother hiding their approach anymore. The leader, a massive battle-scarred wolf with patchy gray fur, stepped into a thin shaft of moonlight. He shifted seamlessly into his human form, a towering, emaciated man with a wicked, predatory grin. "Well, well," the rogue hissed, his voice like grinding stones. "What do we have here? A little bird fallen right out of her nest?" He took a slow, deliberate step forward, breathing in deeply through his nose. His grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "No pack scent," he sneered, looking to his companions who remained in their wolf forms, pacing nervously at his flanks. "And the fresh, bleeding scent of a severed mate bond. Did your alpha throw you away, pretty thing?" Elisa tightened her grip on the branch, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But her expression remained completely impassive. She drew upon the same ironclad composure that had allowed her to stand in the great hall and accept David's rejection. "If you have any sense of self-preservation," Elisa said, her voice ringing out clear and cold in the silent forest, "you will turn around and walk away." The rogue leader threw his head back and laughed, a barking, humorless sound. "A brave little outcast. I like that. The meat tastes better when it has a bit of fight in it." He lunged. David slammed through the heavy oak doors of the pack house, the wood splintering slightly under the sheer, unbridled force of his exit. The freezing night air hit his face like a physical blow, but it did nothing to cool the molten panic surging through his veins. "David, wait!" Marcus yelled, sprinting down the marble steps behind him. The beta was struggling to pull on his jacket, his face pale with alarm. "You can't just run out there blind. Let me gather the border patrol. We need to track them properly." "There is no time for a patrol," David roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the courtyard, causing several night guards to flinch and step back. He didn't stop moving. He couldn't. The phantom sensation in his chest, the erratic, frantic tugging of a bond he thought he had completely severed, was pulling him eastward with the urgency of a fishhook lodged in his heart. It defied all pack lore, all logic. When an alpha rejected a mate, the bond was supposed to wither and die, leaving nothing but an aching scar. But this wasn't a scar. It was a live wire, sparking and thrashing, broadcasting a wave of absolute paralyzing terror that didn't belong to him. He didn't bother unbuttoning his ceremonial coat. He simply tore it off, letting the expensive fabric rip at the seams as he cast it aside onto the frost-covered grass. In a fluid, violent motion, he gave himself over to the shift. The agonizing crunch of elongating bones and shifting muscle was drowned out by the thunderous roar that tore from his throat. Within seconds, the Alpha King stood in his place, a monstrous, midnight black wolf standing nearly at the height of a man's chest, his eyes burning with a terrifying golden luminescence. Marcus skidded to a halt, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Alpha, please. If she's in danger, rushing in blindly could put you both at risk. Let the pack help." David let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the windows of the manor. He didn't need the pack. This was his failure, his catastrophic miscalculation, and he alone would fix it. He turned away from his beta, his massive paws tearing chunks of frozen earth from the ground as he launched himself toward the eastern tree line. The forest blurred past him in a rush of shadow and wind. In his wolf form, the sensory input was overwhelming. He could smell the damp rot of the leaves, the terrified scurry of small prey, and eventually, the faint, floral scent of lavender and vanilla. "Elisa," Beneath her scent lay the sharp, metallic tang of raw fear. As he ran, his mind was a chaotic storm of guilt and revelation. Why had he done it? Why had he stood in the great hall and humiliated her? He had convinced himself it was for the security of the crescent moon. A king needed a queen forged in fire, a warrior who could command respect with a snarl. Elisa, with her soft smiles, her quiet books, and her gentle tending to the pack's children, had seemed too fragile. He had feared that rival packs would see her as a weak link, a vulnerability they could exploit. But as he pushed his massive body faster, dodging trees with lethal precision, the memory of her standing in the hall played on a loop in his mind. I accept your rejection. There had been no tears, no begging, no collapse. Faced with the ultimate degradation, she had maintained absolute, unflinching dignity. She had not broken. He realized now, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that he had profoundly misunderstood the nature of strength. He had confused quiet endurance for weakness. He had mistaken her gentleness for fragility. And in his arrogance, he had stripped away her protection and cast her out into the darkness. Suddenly, a new scent hit his nostrils, cutting through the cold air like a physical blade. It was a foul, pungent odor that made the hackles on his back rise instantly. Rogues, they were close, their scent layered thick over Elisa's trail. And mixed with it was the undeniable, sickening smell of impending violence. David didn't just run. He pushed himself beyond the physical limits of his form. His muscles burned, his lungs screaming for air. But the frantic tugging of the frayed bond fueled him. He tore through a dense thicket of briars, ignoring the thorns that raked across his snout and shoulders. He burst through a line of pines, the terrain dropping sharply into a small valley. Below him, barely illuminated by the fractured moonlight, he saw them. 3 rogue wolves closing in on a fallen oak tree. And standing directly in their path, gripping a heavy branch like a broadsword, was Elisa. A guttural, deafening roar ripped from David's throat as he launched himself down the embankment. Elisa swung the heavy tree branch with every ounce of strength her terror could afford her, as the rogue leader lunged, shifting partially to extend his claws. The rough wood connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. The blow forced the man to stagger sideways, a spray of blood painting the frost-covered leaves. But it was not enough to stop him. Snarling in fury, he backhanded her with a massive, clawed hand. The force of the strike threw Elisa through the air. She slammed hard into the dirt, the wind violently knocked from her lungs. "Elisa!" Leo screamed from the hollow of the tree roots, breaking his promise to stay silent. The rogue leader wiped a smear of blood from his jaw, his eyes flashing with lethal intent. "I'm going to enjoy tearing you apart," he growled, stepping over her discarded weapon. Before he could take another step, the night completely shattered. A massive shadow descended from the embankment above, hitting the ground with the force of a falling meteor. David didn't hesitate. He slammed into the rogue leader with the velocity of a freight train, his jaws snapping shut around the man's throat in a blur of black fur and lethal muscle. The impact sent both of them tumbling violently across the clearing. The remaining 2 rogues, realizing the impossible size and ferocity of the beast that had just attacked them, didn't stay to fight. They tucked their tails and scrambled into the underbrush, vanishing into the night. David pinned the leader to the ground. The rogue struggled wildly, clawing at David's thick fur, but it was useless. The Alpha King's dominance was absolute. With a sharp, brutal twist of his neck, David ended the fight. He tossed the rogue's limp body aside, his chest heaving as he turned his massive head toward the tree roots. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavier and more profound than before. David forced himself to calm down, pushing the feral bloodlust back into the recesses of his mind. He shifted back into his human form, ignoring the biting cold and the stinging scratches on his arms. He was panting, his eyes scanning the darkness frantically until they locked onto her. Elisa was pushing herself up from the frozen ground. Her lip was split and bleeding, and her coat was torn. But she was alive. Relief, so intense it made his knees weak, washed over David. He took a step forward, the words of apology, of desperate explanation already forming on his tongue. He had saved her. He was here. Elisa, he breathed, reaching a hand out toward her. She didn't run to him. She didn't collapse in relief. Instead, she moved with quiet, deliberate speed. She bent down, retrieving the heavy, splintered branch she had dropped. When she straightened up, she placed herself squarely between David and the hollow where Leo was hiding. She gripped the makeshift weapon with both hands, the tip pointed directly at the king's chest. David froze. "Elisa, put that down. It's me. They're gone." "Stop right there," Elisa said. Her voice was raspy, bruised, but entirely devoid of fear. Her dark eyes, the same eyes that had calmly accepted his rejection hours earlier, were now hard as obsidian. "Elisa, you're hurt," David said, taking another hesitant half-step forward. "Let me look at you. We need to get you back to the pack doctor." "We are not going anywhere with you," she stated, her grip on the branch tightening until her knuckles turned stark white. "Don't be foolish," David snapped, a familiar edge of authority creeping back into his voice before he could stop it. "It's not safe out here. You saw what just happened. You need the protection of the crescent moon." "Protection?" Elisa let out a short, incredulous laugh that sounded more like a cough. She spat a small amount of blood onto the frost. "You threw me out of the crescent moon. You stripped me of my title, my home, and my safety in front of hundreds of people. You sent me into these woods knowing exactly what was out here." "I made a mistake," David pleaded, the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a phrase he had never spoken aloud in his entire reign. The bond. It didn't break. I felt it. I felt you were in danger. You felt your property was being threatened. Elisa corrected him coldly. "You didn't come out here because you love me, David. You came out here because an alpha cannot stand to have something that belongs to him taken away. Even if he already threw it in the garbage." David flinched, as if she had struck him with the branch. "That is not true." "It doesn't matter if it's true or not," Elisa said, taking a slow step backward, keeping herself firmly planted in front of the tree roots. Behind her, Leo crawled out of the hollow, his small hands immediately clutching the back of Elisa's torn coat. "You rejected the Luna," Elisa said, her voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "But you will not touch this boy, and you will not touch me. We are leaving. I am your king," David growled, the alpha aura unintentionally flaring around him, demanding submission. Elisa didn't lower her eyes. She stood tall, bruised and bleeding in the moonlight, and delivered a blow far more devastating than any physical weapon. "You were my king," she said softly. "Now, you are just the man who left us to die. Go back to your castle, David. You have no jurisdiction here." The silence that stretched between David and Elisa was heavier than the freezing night air. David, the Alpha King of the Crescent Moon, stood frozen in the moonlit clearing, the absolute authority of his position shattering against the unyielding stone of Elisa's resolve. The Alpha Aura, a suffocating wave of dominance that could force the strongest warriors to their knees, had washed over her and simply evaporated. She had no pack, no title, and ostensibly no mate. Therefore, he had no power over her. David slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his broad chest heaving as the adrenaline of the fight began to recede, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. "I will not force you, Elisa," David said, his voice stripped of its usual commanding resonance. It was a rough, fractured sound. "But you cannot stay out here. The woods are crawling with the displaced. If you will not return to the Crescent Moon, at least allow me to escort you to the border of the Silver Pine territory. They have a sanctuary for—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. "For the rejected. For the exiled." Elisa stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The heavy branch in her hands dipped a fraction of an inch, though her grip remained white-knuckled. Her lip was still bleeding sluggishly, a stark ribbon of red against her pale, bruised skin. "We do not need your escort," Elisa replied, her tone icy. "We need your absence. Every second you are near us, you draw attention. A king does not travel without a wake of violence. Walk away, David, before your enemies realize you are out here alone." She didn't wait for his compliance. Elisa dropped the branch, turned her back on him, and gently took Leo's trembling hand. She adjusted the heavy duffel bag on her shoulder, began to walk deeper into the treacherous wilderness, stepping over the frost-hardened roots with deliberate, measured paces. David stood completely still until they were swallowed by the dense shadows of the ancient pines. Every instinct screaming within his blood demanded he scoop her up, carry her back to the impenetrable safety of his fortress, and lock the world away. But the memory of her standing in the great hall, composed, dignified, utterly unbroken by his cruelty, anchored him to the spot. To force her now would not be an act of protection. It would be the ultimate act of destruction. He waited until their scent began to fade slightly on the wind. Then, without a sound, David shifted back into his massive, midnight black wolf form. He would not force her to return, but he would also not leave her to the mercy of the wild. If she demanded his absence, she would have it. He would become a ghost in the trees, a silent guardian trailing far behind them, ensuring nothing and no one would ever lay a hand on her again. For hours, the agonizing trek continued. Elisa moved with a painful, limping gait, her adrenaline crashing to reveal the true extent of her injuries from the rogue strike. Yet, she never stopped. David stalked them from a mile away, staying downwind, navigating the treacherous terrain with silent pause. He eliminated 2 more rogue scouts without a sound, dragging their bodies into the ravines so Elisa would never even know they were there. As dawn began to bleed a pale, bruised purple across the horizon, the scent of wood smoke cut through the scent of pine. David slowed his pace, his golden eyes narrowing. Ahead, nestled in a deep, secluded valley, lay a cluster of fortified wooden cabins surrounded by a high, silver-laced palisade, the sanctuary. It was neutral ground, a place where pack politics meant nothing. He watched from the ridge as Elisa and Leo approached the heavy timber gates. A sentry appeared, speaking to Elisa for a brief moment before the gates swung inward, welcoming them into the warmth and safety of the compound. As the heavy wooden doors slammed shut, the finality of the sound echoed in David's chest. She was safe, and she was gone. The sanctuary was a place of quiet, methodical healing, built on the shattered foundations of broken lives. Inside the modest infirmary, An older woman named Clara, a healer whose own mate had perished decades ago, gently dabbed a stinging antiseptic onto Elisa's split lip. "You took a nasty hit, child," Clara murmured, her voice like dry leaves. "But you're lucky. A few inches higher, and that rogue would have crushed your cheekbone. You fought him off yourself?" "I had to," Elisa said quietly, her gaze fixed on the small cot across the room where Leo was finally sleeping, his face clean and his stomach full of warm broth. "We had no one else." Clara paused, her perceptive gray eyes studying Elisa's stoic expression. "Is that so?" "Because the sentries tell me there is a wolf the size of a small mountain, sitting precisely 3 yards outside our boundary line. He has been there since dawn. The silver wards in the palisade are giving him a migraine, I'm sure, but he refuses to move." Elisa's breath hitched in her throat, a sudden sharp pain lancing through her chest. She looked away, staring down at her bruised hands resting in her lap. "He is not my concern," Elisa whispered, though the slight tremble in her voice betrayed her. "He made his choice yesterday in the great hall of the Crescent Moon. His presence out there is just guilt. It will fade." "Perhaps," Clara said mildly, taping a bandage over the cut on Elisa's forehead. "But guilt rarely sits still in freezing sleet for 6 hours without seeking shelter. That looks a great deal like penance, my dear. And penance is a dangerous thing for a king." Outside the palisade, the weather had turned vicious. The morning frost had given way to a bitter, biting sleet that coated the world in a treacherous layer of ice. David remained in his human form, sitting on a fallen log directly facing the sanctuary gates. He wore only his torn shirt and trousers, his skin pale and shivering, but he made no move to find cover. A heavy, rhythmic thudding approached from the eastern tree line. Beta Marcus emerged from the brush, flanked by 4 of the Crescent Moon's elite guards. Marcus carried a heavy fur cloak over his arm, his expression tight with worry and suppressed anger. "Alpha," Marcus said, stopping a respectful distance away. He held out the cloak. "Please, you are risking pneumonia. The pack is in chaos. They need their king." David didn't look at his beta. His eyes remained fixed on a small window near the top of the infirmary cabin. "The pack has you, Marcus. You know the protocols. Govern in my stead." "This is madness, David," Marcus argued, taking a step forward and dropping the formalities. "You rejected her. You broke the bond. Sitting out here in the ice will not magically undo the words you spoke before the elders. If you want her back, order a siege. We can take this sanctuary in an hour." David slowly turned his head, his eyes flashing with a sudden, lethal goal that made the 4 elite guards instinctively step backward. "If any Crescent Moon wolf places a single claw on that palisade," David growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that cut through the sound of the sleet, "I will execute them myself. Do you understand me, Marcus?" Marcus swallowed hard, recognizing the absolute sincerity in the king's threat. "I understand. But what are you trying to accomplish here? You are punishing yourself." "I am learning," David said softly, looking back at the infirmary window. "I thought strength was a loud, commanding thing. I thought ruling meant never showing a vulnerability. I tore out my own heart to prove a point to the elders. And in doing so, I nearly killed the only person who possessed true strength." He closed his eyes as the sleet plastered his dark hair to his forehead. "I don't expect her to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I will not leave this line. I will be the wall between her and the wilderness I threw her into." The attack came just after midnight. The rogue pack that had accosted Elisa in the woods had not dispersed. They had merely regrouped. Driven by starvation and the lingering scent of crescent moon blood, a dozen of them descended upon the valley. They didn't care about the sanctuary's neutrality. They only cared that the silver wards were old, and the wooden gates could be breached with enough force. Elisa jolted awake in the infirmary as the first panicked screams echoed from the courtyard. She rushed to the window, her heart slamming against her ribs. Below, the sentries were scrambling to the palisade, firing arrows into the darkness. But the sheer number of frantic, snarling rogues throwing themselves against the timber was overwhelming. Then, she saw him. David hadn't called for his guards, who had retreated miles back on his orders. He stood entirely alone before the heavy wooden gates, a solitary figure between the desperate, starving pack and the vulnerable people inside. He didn't fight like a king defending his territory. He fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He shifted into his massive wolf form, a localized hurricane of black fur, snapping jaws, and lethal precision. He took on 3 rogues at once, tossing them aside, but for every one he downed, 2 more took their place. Elisa watched in mounting horror as a massive brute of a wolf managed to flank David, sinking its teeth deep into the king's shoulder. David roared, shaking the beast off. But the damage was done. He was bleeding heavily, his movements slowing as exhaustion and the sheer weight of numbers began to drag him down. "He's going to die out there," Clara said softly, standing beside Elisa at the window. Elisa couldn't breathe. The phantom bond in her chest, the connection she thought was completely dead, pulsed with a sudden, searing agony. It wasn't the pain of rejection. It was the pain of witnessing a sacrifice. He wasn't fighting for his pride. He was bleeding into the snow so she wouldn't have to. "Open the gates," Elisa whispered. Clara looked at her sharply. "Child, if we open those gates, the rogues will pour in." "Open the gates," Elisa shouted, spinning away from the window and sprinting down the wooden stairs. She reached the courtyard just as the heavy wooden bar was lifted by the terrified sentries. As the gates swung outward, the chaotic din of battle rushed in. David, severely wounded and panting heavily, stood amidst the bodies of the fallen rogues. The remaining few, realizing the battle was lost against this monstrous defender, had fled into the tree line. David shifted back to his human form. He was a devastating sight. Deep claw marks tracked across his chest, and blood poured freely from the bite on his shoulder, staining the white snow beneath his boots. He swayed on his feet, his breathing ragged, but as he saw Elisa standing in the open gateway, a faint, weary smile touched his lips. He didn't step forward. He didn't try to cross the boundary line. Slowly, agonizingly, the Alpha King of the Crescent Moon dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable curve of his neck, the ultimate gesture of absolute submission. "I was wrong," David rasped, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "I was arrogant and I was foolish. I rejected the best part of myself because I was too cowardly to defend it against the expectations of others." Elisa stood frozen, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. The silence in the courtyard was profound, mirroring the devastating silence of the great hall. But the context was entirely inverted. "I do not ask you to return to the Crescent Moon," David continued, forcing the words out through the pain. "I do not ask you to reinstate the bond. You are free, Elisa. Truly free. I give you my word as king that no wolf of my pack will ever cross your path again, unless you command it." He looked up at her, his golden eyes raw and completely devoid of the Alpha's pride. "I just needed to know you were safe." Elisa took a step forward, crossing the silver boundary line. The bitter cold bit at her, but she barely felt it. She walked through the blood-stained snow until she stood directly in front of the kneeling king. She looked down at the man who had broken her heart, the man who had just traded his life for hers without demanding a single thing in return. The hollow cavern in her chest where the bond had been didn't magically heal, but the bitter, jagged edges of the wound began to soften. "You are a fool, David," Elisa said softly, her voice carrying a profound, weary tenderness. She didn't throw her arms around his neck. She didn't instantly forgive the public humiliation, but she reached out her bruised, bandaged hand, offering it to him. "Get up," she commanded gently. "You're bleeding on my sanctuary's doorstep. Let Clara stitch you up. Then we will talk." David stared at her hand for a long moment, a profound sense of awe washing over his exhausted features. He reached out, his large, bloodied hand engulfing hers. As their skin made contact, a faint, tentative warmth sparked in the frigid air between them. Not a forced bond of fate, but the fragile, undeniable beginning of a choice. True strength isn't found in the volume of a command or the absence of vulnerability, but in the quiet courage to accept consequences and the humility to kneel when you are wrong. Elisa and David's journey proves that while a broken bond leaves a devastating scar, it can also clear the foundation for something built on mutual respect and profound choice, rather than just the dictates of fate. The Alpha King learned that the most powerful thing he could do was not to claim his mate, but to set her free. If you enjoyed this cinematic journey of pride, sacrifice, and redemption, please like this story, share it with fellow romance and drama lovers, and subscribe for more gripping, emotional tales. Your support helps bring more of these grounded, intense worlds to life.